So today we've got Annie Chiang, who will be talking about her PhD work, Not Just Another Statistic, a critical data study of missingness in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Annie is a doctoral candidate with the School of Population Health. She is an experienced user of the integrated data infrastructure. She is particularly interested in the role data plays in society and the ethics of data use and collection. She is currently a professional teaching fellow for the DigiHealth 703 New Zealand Health Data Landscape and is the database manager for the National Child Cancer Network.
Kia ora koutou ko Taiwana, te Taiwana whakapaparanga mai, ko Tamaki Makaurau, te whenua tupu, ko Whanganui Atara, te kāinga, ko Annie toku ingoa. I'm Annie. Thanks so much for inviting me. Thanks again for coming. I am an interloper from the School of Population Health. So my thesis is about missingness, and missingness has kind of been a theme throughout all of my postgraduate study. So I started off doing a PG Dip special topics with two of my supervisors, Dan Exeter and Richard Edlin, and it was a project called Who Misses Out, and that was looking at, you know, if we were to use either DEP or if we were to use IMD, how would the funding based on the population-based funding formula, how would that change the distribution of funding across DHBs? I'm not going to comment on the quality of my work from back then, but it was like kind of my first taste of that idea that, you know, how we use data, what metrics we use has a really, you know, powerful impact on real life and what people get and how we manage our resources in the country. And then in my master's, I started working with the IDI. That was my first taste of the IDI, and I was really, really excited. It seemed like such an awesome thing. And it's still I still very much think it is an awesome thing. So that project was looking at suicide risk in New Zealand, just looking at correlates of suicide risk, and it was looking at the census population and those who subsequently suicided after 2013. And what really stuck with me wasn't really so much the findings. Again, first project in the IDI, have learned a lot since then. But what I kind of took away from that was an incidental finding. And you'll learn that I love incidental findings, the unintentional things that we seem to pick up through our research. So one of the incidental findings that I noticed was that there was a proportion and a not insignificant proportion of individuals who had died as a result of suicide that were not in the census. Of course, now with a few more years of data lab experience, I would go back and kind of maybe link a little bit more. But that was, again, something that stuck with me because I'm like, it suggests that there's a non-zero chance that there are people who we don't have data about, that we don't capture throughout their lifetime. And that possibility is what worried me. I was worried about what did it mean for these individuals? Like, were they just left to their own devices? Did we fail them? Did the government fail them in some way? Or, you know, is research using data, no matter how much data you have, is it all just a lie? Like, maybe. And kind of since then, I've just kept kind of thinking about those problems and that worry, that overthinking. I had to deal with it, and PhD apparently is the way to deal with those problems. So I ended up, you know, getting to do this project, just looking at this idea of missingness within population data sets, focusing on government collected data sets. Explain a little bit why later. And that's kind of where we are today, an overthinker trying not to overthink so much anymore, but failing at that. But yes, so here's the plan for today. So I'm going to give you the rationale for my research, which is more than just my overthinking. Give you an introduction to critical data studies, which is, I guess, the body of research that strongly informed like the theoretical decisions that I've made, and also where I feel like the disciplinary home for this thesis might actually be. There were 3 phases of research in the study. I'll give you the top notes of the results in there. It's going to be pretty light on theory for this particular presentation. And then kind of integrating all those findings is a conceptual framework about types of missingness and what we might do about them. And then the kind of usual standard strengths and weaknesses of and future opportunities for the research. So what is missingness? So for those of you who do use data on the regular or are statistically inclined, you'll probably be familiar with missing at random, missing completely at random, missing not completely, MNAR, not completely at random. So that's kind of like the statistical framework for what missingness is, and the goal of kind of being able to ascribe that those patterns of missingness is for us to say, how have these data come to be missed, and how might we respond in a statistical sense to that type of missingness? And Little and Rubin's quote here, I think it's kind of encapsulates that well, in the sense that missing data are unobserved values that would be meaningful if they were observed, so if we had them. So what that suggests to me is that this is, again, it's an analytic-centered definition of missingness. We only care about the things that make a difference to the analytical outcome. So yeah, I mean, I was probably comfortable with that definition in year 1, but now we're in year 4. I'm more kind of leaning towards this one. So it's a little bit more general, but I think it encompasses Little and Rubin's definition, but it's really about missingness is describing missing data that should be collected but are not. And I think that that word of should is doing the most of the work here, because it doesn't just ask us about, what should we be doing for the analytic outcome and to address a research question, but it also asks us, like, what data should be collected, whose data should we collect, what should we be collecting, and what shouldn't we be collecting. So it's more of like a normative statement. It's more of an ethical position that we're taking when we're answering this question, and it kind of asks us to think about more than just the data that we're looking at. We're kind of, again, centering on the person rather than the data itself. So the rationale for this research, the first one is that being missed equals being invisible. And so this really comes from my interest in looking at the data, the IDI and government data, because, what we hear of on the daily is data-driven policy, data-driven decision-making. And every politician will have data. We hope they will have data to support and justify their decisions. And they will rely on those data sets that we have the privilege of using in the IDI, so administrative data or the census, to inform and justify the calls that they're making. So the rationale or the logic is that if you don't exist in the data set, you effectively don't exist in that consideration, that, people who get to make decisions, impactful decisions, you aren't factored into that process for them. So you're effectively invisible. And that, to me, just, there's an ick factor to that. And that's kind of where all this thinking began. Of course, there is underlying theories related to social contract theory, but we'll park that to the side for today, I think. And we already know through census and through, if you've ever tried recruiting for participants, that missingness, people that you don't collect information about, that's not a random thing. Yeah, so, we know that certain groups don't get counted in data sets. So, for example, census undercounts Māori and Pacifica chronically. If we're looking at health data sets, men don't go to see their GPs, so we have less data on them. We have less data on, again, Māori and Pacifica in health data as well. And, that kind of pattern exists in all the data sets that we see. And in certain data sets, maybe the less favorable ones, we're counting more people and less of others. And so one of the things that we all have to kind of address is also our obligations to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and also, thinking about, is data representing and benefiting people in an equitable way? Is it benefiting everyone, or is it being used to harm or to perpetuate sort of negative stereotypes or harms that have been done in the past? And so very much it is a commitment to Te Tiriti why we have to consider missingness as well, because we already know who data fails in New Zealand. And finally, the next rationale is about the changes in the way that people have been counted in New Zealand. So we have already observed the Statistics Act 1975 is no longer in force. It is now the Data and Statistics Bill 2022, and we'll talk about that in the first study. And we also know that the census for the last two censuses haven't gone so well. Statistics New Zealand has recently gone through like a consultation period to kind of throw in the idea of doing an administrative census. So what would the future look like should we not have that traditional survey-based census, every 5 years? What would that mean for us? And so with all that kind of context in mind, that's why I think this topic is topical and timely. So critical data studies is kind of the natural home to this, to my research. And it makes a few key assumptions about data. And I think it probably it jived well with me when I came across it. And hopefully it kind of resonates with some of the questions you have about data or the kind of things that you're not so sure about. So the first assumption is that more data does not equal better data. So that's thinking about things like the digital divide. So it's saying that sometimes the technological barriers are there. That means the people who have access, knowledge, capability to provide the data, that's who you're going to get data about. It also means that people who engage with public services, that's who you're going to get information about. But the people who are really hard to capture, you're just going to continue, unless you change something about your systems, collecting more data, you're not actually going to capture them at all. It also means that the quality of data might not be better just because you have more, because it really depends on the questions that you ask. So just thinking about, just because we have a whole of population data set, it's questioning, is it really the whole of population that we're actually capturing? The next one is data equals power. So although having more data doesn't mean that it's necessarily better data, what we can kind of assume is that the more data you have, the more power you have. And that's thinking about, like, everyone in this room is able to use data in some way. Think about how valuable that makes you as a practitioner. Think about the ways that data is used to justify a decision and how that kind of, if you say evidence supports blah, 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 how much weight it gives. And also thinking about the ways that the person who collects data asks the questions is effectively able to influence or construct narratives about people who don't have that ability and don't have that access. Data are contextual, and a very recent poignant quote kind of explains this better than I could. Kamala Harris said, "It's not like we just fell out of a coconut tree." This is what data are contextual means. So essentially, data is relational. It's created through our experiences, created through social interactions. It's meaningful because of what's happening, in this kind of physical, emotional, social world. Without that, the data doesn't really mean anything. So it's always thinking about those relationalities that happen with data. And the final one is that data are never raw. So it's just recognizing that throughout that data process, whether it's collection, designing the questions, designing how people can answer, to your data cleaning process, your interpretation process, the theoretical frames you bring to that, all of that comes together. Even when you're looking at the raw data, that process has already started. So we can never assume that data are raw and neutral and just there because we've created it. So within critical data studies, a lot of practitioners or scholars in this field adopt assemblage theory. And I'm just going to breeze through this one. My PYR was all about this, and I don't want to do that again. So assemblage theory is the ontological perspective for my thesis, and is kind of what glues everything together in the background. Behind you, you can see all those dots and links. That's kind of like a visual representation of an assemblage. And so assemblage is effectively like when lots of different things, human things, structural things, non-human things, all come together to create what we're observing, a phenomena. It could create an idea. And the idea is that these ideas are always in this process of kind of coming together. They could come together strongly because, we all buy into it and it's being reinforced constantly, or ideas could fall apart when, competing theories appear, or we don't buy into it, we're not convinced. So it's just this assumption that knowledge, ideas, phenomena are always in a state of flux and coming together and being created, and is made up of lots of different things. And so this is a very simple explanation of assemblage theory. So no quotes here for that. So with assemblage theory, we can translate that into a slightly more manageable way of thinking about data. And this is the data assemblage. And again, you can see there's lots of different elements to it. We have to think about the theories that we're bringing along to thinking about data, the structures in the sense of like the infrastructure that we have access to, the legislative structures that we have to work within, maybe the institutional ethics, what parameters or what boundaries that they set for us. Things like marketplaces, about the desire for data. Does society have an appetite for data-driven technologies, or do they not? Are they like really worried about it, or perhaps they don't have access to it? So all those things come into play. And so naturally, if I'm adopting this kind of ontological perspective, it kind of requires me to take a few different approaches to looking at this idea of missingness that I want to explore. And so the question that I am going to answer, and then I'll get into the different parts of my methodology. So the question is, how might missingness occur in government collected data sets in New Zealand? And how should state and citizens respond? So how might is a very classic assemblage way of asking a question, because everything's kind of always in a state of flux. I'm just offering one perspective, and that's, contextually driven by my context. Focusing on New Zealand, for me, it's the context that I belong to. It's the IDI is what I study, work in, but it's also, New Zealand is kind of like a unique little enclave down at the bottom of the globe, in the sense that the IDI is quite a special infrastructure, and also digital technologies, for some reason, like to be tested here. We're kind of ripe testing ground for new things because of our size and our diverse population. So again, exploring something within New Zealand in relation to data technologies just makes sense. And how should state and citizen respond? That one, again, I mentioned social contract theory before. That kind of underpins my thinking altogether. So I'm really thinking about state in the sense of like the government or public institutions, and citizens in the most general sense. So anyone who is in New Zealand is what I mean by citizens, not referring to any kind of set legal status to be in New Zealand when I use that particular word. So that's the overall question. And to address that, taking three different approaches. So the first one, we're looking at legislation. So we're looking at the structural things. Well, you'll see those questions in big in a moment. Phase 2, that's IDI work, that's quantitative. And phase 3 is to address the parts that all those other sections can't do, is to find out, from the perspective of people who might be missed, what's going on. So hopefully we'll have a complete story by the end of this. So phase 1, looking at our data and privacy legislation in New Zealand, there were 3 main documents that I focused on. The Statistics Act 1975. At the time when I came up with my project, it was still relevant because it was still in force. So I'm holding on to that one. And the Privacy Act, which for me, the statistics legislation or data legislation and privacy, they kind of are, in a way, counterbalances to each other. One says what the state can do, and the privacy legislation really describes what individuals are able to do, or able to, how they might be able to control their data or know about their data. The Data and Statistics Act 2022 repealed and replaced the Statistics Act, but kind of looking back towards the history of what the Statistics Act set up, really, we can see how things have changed since then, and that change, I think, is quite important. And so I approached this by looking at more ethical concepts of duties, claim rights, and powers. So duties being in the simplest sense, claim rights is like, I'm asking Natalia, can I please be your friend? And then, and if you agree to that, you consent to that, then you have a duty to be my friend. Like, so I'm claiming that thing that I want, and you have a duty to provide it for me. Really terrible example, but hopefully that answer. And powers in this kind of sense, is the ability for us to create claim rights, so to create rights for other parties. So after analyzing these three acts, somehow summarized many words down to three bullet points. So in terms of the state's duties, claim rights, responsibilities, the state has a duty to collect data. They have a duty to improve its quality and eliminate gaps in the data that are collected. So that kind of particular framing comes from the Data and Statistics Act 2022. Previously, it was just about collection. They've now added a little bit more kind of detail into what is required. However, I would say eliminate gaps is arguably quite firm, but improve its quality is a little bit vague. So what is an improvement? Is it a little improvement? Is it a big improvement? That's open to interpretation. This, as I mentioned before, Statistics Act was the predecessor, and then Data and Statistics Act came along, and it really extended the powers and claim rights that Statistics New Zealand has. And so what that means is, an example is, this is the next bullet point. So what is new about the Data and Statistics Act is that the Minister of Statistics decides what we want to collect, and then the chief statistician can come along and say, hey, Immigration New Zealand, we would like you to collect these particular data points. Go ahead and do it. So that was something that I hadn't realized about the structure of our kind of data landscape in New Zealand until I did this project. So all agencies are collecting data about individuals. However, Stats sets the concepts. So they kind of sit slightly above everyone else. They can tell other agencies what to collect, and now they can tell agencies specifically what they want. And the bill, in the sense, is not very clear on what the boundaries of that are. So does INZ only collect information that's relevant to immigration, or can they collect other things because they're compelled to do so by Stats NZ? So that's kind of where a lot of the, I guess, tensions came up when it came to debating, or sort of a lot of the public submissions were really concerned about this point, because it really means the chief statistician, and by extension the Minister of Statistics, who's a political appointment, have a lot of power with regards to what we collect. So with all that power, what kind of counterbalances do we have for individuals? So previously there was some way we could say no, but that's now gone. So previously, before the new act came through, we could refuse data collection in a couple of ways. We could refuse to respond to questions about religion, and we could refuse joint collection. So that's when two public agencies come to an agreement that they're going to share data with each other. We used to be able to say, write to the chief statistician, I object to this, and then they wouldn't be able to do that with your specific data. That is now silent. It doesn't get mentioned in the Data and Statistics Act, so we assume that right is now gone. For the Privacy Act, so the Privacy Act usually, there's the information privacy principles that says if a business or an organization has information about you, you can go to them and ask them, what information do you have? What are you using it for? You're not using it for the right thing. That's bad. Goes to the Privacy Commissioner. However, all those rights and protections that the Privacy Act offers does not apply to Stats NZ, which is what's created by the Data and Statistics Act. So really, we have no exemptions as individuals when Stats comes calling. And when Stats does come calling, not that scared. So when Stats comes and asks for your information, I mean, you can say no, but once you say no, you will be liable for penalties, usually financial penalties. The dollar amount of that went up with this new act. However, once you pay that penalty, you are still subject to that claim that Stats is making. So you have no privilege or right to say no to requests that Stats makes, which makes Stats feel like a really powerful agency. I think it's a little bit scary. But my dealings with stats have been all right today. Yeah, so what this kind of suggests to us is that the state has a lot of power. They have duties to collect data, to eliminate gaps, but all the kind of duties to provide the data sits with individuals. And to me, that just felt really imbalanced. And so to answer this question very simply, legally, I would argue it's citizens ultimately that have the responsibility, because even though the Stats NZ has a duty to collect, they're putting all that responsibility but through compelling citizens to provide their data. So ultimately, it comes down to citizens being data subjects. Ethically, which is a little bit broader, it's thinking about what things should be. I think it really sits between a little bit of both. We have a duty to provide, because it's in our interest as individuals to provide data so that we can get the resources that we need. But it's very much also in the state's role to make sure that we are able to provide the data that they need to take care of us. So the next phase of research is the quantitative component. Standard Statistics New Zealand disclaimer, as I use IDI data for this. And I focused on, there were two kind of studies. So this is study one, and it is aiming to answer the question of how does the current census and the APC, if we, compared them on the same day, what differences would there be? And Stats NZ has published kind of similar reports on this. My results are very much comparable, so I feel like I did something right. So the goal of this one is to kind of understand who are we going to miss, what are the opportunity costs, who misses out if we were to abandon the census and just go with the APC. So the APC, for those who don't know, I don't know how many people are on Zoom, but it's essentially if we were to abandon the census and just go with admin data, so data that is collected when people interact with public agencies. So the first analysis is just a really quick comparison at the aggregate. So total population captured by the census, total population by APC, what do they look like? And on the whole, they are really similar. And we're talking like there's only like 100,000 difference between these two population sets. So Stats views this as a win. And I think as researchers, when we're looking at aggregate level data, it suggests that the APC is a really useful and I would say a much easier data set to use than the census. And I'm focusing on sort of ethnic distributions because, as we'll see, that becomes a prominent component in the differences between these two data sets. But generally, what we can see in the table is just the distribution by ethnicity. This is total response, is pretty good, and it reflects the census. So we're kind of on the track here. And in terms of age, sex, and gender, it is also comparable. So the next step is to think about many steps. So we started off with just looking at the aggregate. We weren't interested in the individuals. Now we're bringing together these two data sets via data linkage and looking at individuals. Do they appear in the census? Do they appear in the APC? Or do they appear in both? So we've got three different groups that we're comparing. The group in the middle, census and APC, because we're kind of suspecting that there is good alignment between these two data sets. That group kind of fits that general population, that general composition of the population that we already observed in that previous slide. So cool. If you want to, again, that just shows that if you wanted to use the APC census at this level, this aggregate level, it's going to be fine. However, if we look at ethnic differences, we're starting to see that there is an ethnic dimension here. So if you look at the differences between European, Māori, and Asian, what we see is, there's like 13,000 European, there's less of them in the APC, there's less Māori in the APC, and less Asian, but relative to the proportion of those ethnic groups, it's a relatively high proportion of Māori that are missing from the APC and relatively high proportion of Asians that are missing from the APC. So that is just the first inkling that something, there's a non-random thing that's happening here. So looking at just these two groups on the side, census only and APC only, we can see that Europeans are generally well captured because most of them appear in both the data sets. Asian people are more likely to only appear in one. So that means they either only appear in the census or either only appear in the APC, suggesting there might be some errors. So there might be some people who aren't filling in the census, or that the APC is missing people based on their methodology. And I'll show you the methodology in a couple of slides. So what it suggests is, if you are a European person, APC census, you're good for both. So this is my third analysis, again, continuing on looking at that unit level analysis. So there are some assumptions that we can make in that we know that ethnicity, especially with total response, and sometimes even prioritized, depending on what data set you're pulling the ethnicity data from, the ethnicity could be different. So somebody might not be collecting it correctly, or you might be responding differently because you feel like one particular ethnicity is more relevant in a particular context. And so we expect differences there. We can expect reasonably some discrepancies in gender as well, because we accept that that might change over time. And so those two, I'm kind of popping those to the side and just focusing on age. Age is what we use to do the probabilistic matching. So one would hope that your age doesn't change. So what you can see over in the top table, the match, minor, and major discrepancies. The minor is like ones where the age calculated based on census day and the year of birth, that there's only like 1 year either side. So those ones I'm like, okay, let's just park those to the side, because it could just be that we didn't have the day or the month correct. Not too big of an issue. The ones that I'm particularly worried about is the major discrepancy. So those are people whose age differs between the APC and the census by more than 1 year. So that means there's an error in one of those data sets. So who does that error affect more? Again, looking down at ethnicity, it appears to be Māori at 22%. A high proportion of those in this major discrepancy group are Māori, high proportion are Pacific, high proportion are Asian. So again, it's saying that these errors, again, have an ethnic dimension. They're less likely to affect Europeans, more likely to affect non-Europeans. Second part of the study is really focusing in on the APC itself. So at the time, and I still think that this might be true, that there's not very many independent studies of the APC itself as yet, because it's still very much an experimental data set. So the APC, it constructs a cohort using lots of different criteria, but mainly it's if you're over the age of 5, you need to have interacted with either tax, health, education, or have flown into the country and crossed one of our borders. And there is the caveat that it needs to be a long-term visa. For those under 5, so long as you've crossed the border on a long-term visa, or you've been born in New Zealand, you'll be counted up until the point that you turn 5, and then after that, ideally, you'll enter school and be counted that way. There are some exclusions. We exclude those who have died by the reference date. So that will be the census day or whichever date you want to choose for your study. And we also link it to migration data. So if you leave the country. And so that kind of logic will become relevant in a moment. So I wanted to get an understanding of how many people or which people are being missed by the methodology itself. So applying what you saw in the previous slide to this logic, essentially there are 2 ways reasonably that people can be excluded. You're excluded from the APC if you leave New Zealand, and the 12-16 rule means that you leave for 12 months of the next 16 months. So you've departed semi-permanently, we hope. So you either depart New Zealand or you die, so you're no longer part of our population. But then the third way of leaving the APC is not because you've died, it's not because you've departed, it's because you haven't had any interaction with a public agency that is part of that inclusion criteria. So one would assume you're in New Zealand, you're just not interacting. So that's why you call it inactive for 2 years. For those who are included in the APC, there are again 3 ways to be included. You're included when you arrive on one of those long-term visas, when you are born, or when after a period of inactivity, you do something, you pay tax, you get a job, you enroll at uni, whatever it is, you now get counted because there's something observable that you've done. So what that what I'm a bit worried about is who make up those orange populations, who is getting missed because they've just simply been inactive. Just because you're in the, inactive, does that mean you don't get counted in this country, even though you're here? So looking at those who have, this is just a summary table of the populations that make up the match group. So people who, were in 2015 and APC 2020. So they've, we've tracked them. They might have come in and out of the country, but they're here in 2015, they're here in 2020. For B, these are people who have exited. So we're thinking they were here in 2015, but don't appear again in 2020. C, entries are those that weren't in 2015 and have since arrived. So for the exits, these are kind of the observations that we expect to see. Exits have a higher proportion of older individuals because older individuals are more likely to die. For entries, higher proportion of younger individuals because young people are the ones that are born. And entries and exits, they contain high proportions of Mila and Asians, so our migrant populations. And because they're in both the entries and exits, it suggests that there's lots of mobility going. There are lots of people coming in, lots of people going out, which kind of makes sense. So if we just look at those who exit, so those numbers on this side. So we can see the proportions of those who depart, leave New Zealand or die is relatively high, but about 10% of the exit population are just lost due to inactivity. And children are less likely to be lost just because they've got that period of inclusion where they don't have to do anything. As soon as they're born, 5 years, they get for free effectively. And the logistic regression demonstrates that Māori are the only ethnic group that seem to be more likely to be missed due to inactivity. So it seems like disengagement might lead to missingness in data. So thinking about those who come in, there is an additional group there. So we look at the ones who we kind of say those who arrive during birth, as a result of birth or arrival, we know what's happened there. And then we have to think about, do we want to include those who had a prior arrival but somehow been lost to inactivity, or those that just haven't been inactive? So what I decided to do was to just focus on those who have an inactivity. So those are ones who is in the data set but have no travel data at all. So there is no evidence that they've ever arrived into New Zealand. So they were born into New Zealand, but they're not counted in our data set, or they've just been lost the data set. There's no evidence that they've left. There's no evidence that they've died. And that's where I feel like there is some evidence to suggest that there are people who are in New Zealand that do not appear in these data sets or will drop out. And for those, again, it's those ethnic populations. So with the reference group for this logistic regression, it was Europeans as the reference group. So again, it's if you're a non-European person, there is a higher chance that you are going to drop out of the APC at some point. So phase 3. So the previous studies essentially allowed us to establish some roles and responsibilities. The quantitative data kind of gave us a little bit of empirical evidence to suggest that the APC might not serve certain groups as well as others. But what it kind of doesn't help us explain is why that missingness occurs, what's happening in the lives of individuals that means that they get missed. And so I went out looking for people who are likely to be missed, and that was a long process, but we got there in the end. So I ended up doing three individual interviews and 2 group interviews. And the group interviews were with former refugees. So the first thing that we've identified in terms of that was really common, and definitely the thing that we talked about the most, was about negative experiences of public services. And so Waimirirangi was a Māori woman, and she talked a lot about her brother's experience, about going to the hospital, like going to his doctor, complaining about chronic pain and being told, you're not serious. You're just being lazy and you just don't want to work. You just go back and work. They ended up getting a diagnosis of stage 4 bowel cancer because of what happened. And you can see how these negative experiences, he just didn't want to go back anymore, because why would you go back and continue re-engaging with a service that just does not take your needs seriously? The next one, quote by Annie, she chose that pseudonym. So for Annie, her experience was, I thought, really interesting and one that I did not expect. And so she is someone who kind of understands, has a sense of what services are out there for her, but she actively chose to disengage from them. And the reason is because she is a smoker, and she puts a lot of blame, self-stigma on herself, saying smokers are bad people, they do not deserve public services because they incur more cost. That's the narrative that she's been told, and she's very much internalized it. And that, to me, just doesn't feel right. In terms of public health, that's not our intention, to make people feel bad. Like, ideally, we would support her to quit smoking, but if she can't, we wouldn't begrudge her these public services, but she's self-selected out. The last one, Ronan, is a refugee parent. And so for Ronan, it's really about this feeling of shame. So he would rely on his children. He still faces a language barrier, even though having been in New Zealand for many, many years. And he just feels like he can't support his children. So why would he keep interacting with services that require him to speak English, that continue to make him feel, like an inadequate person? So we can see why, these negative experiences would prompt people to just to step back away from services and not engage further. However, that doesn't change the fact that they are often in need. And so for Marjorie, she shared a story about sending her daughter to hospital, and her, she had a chronic illness and she constantly needed to go to hospital. But basic things like because they were refugees, they didn't have access to the food that they were familiar with, and really the quick change in diet meant that their kids were actually getting really sick from the food that they were being offered. And the choice for the daughter was to stop eating in hospital. And so and it's really hard, like, thinking about having to force your daughter to go to hospital. So what we found with a lot of these refugee parents, they'll encourage their children to go and access those services. They often neglect their own needs, but also this signals kind of this generational learning of bad experiences. So her daughter now will have a resistance to engaging with services on her own because of these bad experiences. For Hinemoa, it was about delaying care. She only goes to services when she absolutely needs to. And so what it suggests to us is that we see kind of little glimpses of data and how people engage, but we might not see the full story of their experience. So themes 3 and 4 is really about how people are trying to navigate through these systems. So playing the game is, Annie, the participant, was the one that came up with this phrase, but she's playing the game in the sense that she's trying to kind of buy into narratives or selectively disclose information so that, she gets the care that she needs. And so for Hinemoa, she, admits that she isn't 100% honest when she needs care. She says the things that she needs to get the care that she needs. So what that says to us in terms of data is that we're only getting snippets of the story. We're not getting the full picture. And, what does that mean for our analysis? How might that impact what we're, the assumptions that we're making or the stories that we're telling? And for Waimirirangi, she was actually a public health promoter. So she knew how to play the game. She's helping other people navigate the system. But when she called up to her GP's office, they recognized that she was a Māori patient and insisted that she wait for an appointment, didn't give her an appointment until someone else who knew her at the clinic said, she's someone who pays up front. She's someone who makes sure, pays their bills all the time. And then she got an appointment straight away. And bear in mind, this was for asthma. So one would think there would be no questions asked, you'd come in and you'd get seen. And so what this suggests is knowing the rules of how to navigate the system, how to engage in the right way. Sometimes it's not enough, because barriers like racism and stigma, they're just there, and it can just be too much to overcome. And again, that leads to missingness, leads to, lower quality data being collected. So for our refugee populations, for them, because the language barrier was so high, they're often turning to informal supports. So for some migrant groups, really for the refugee populations, we have to think about groups for whom there is a really small number of people. We might not actually have translators that are available to help them overcome that language barrier. So for them, they're going to their community, they're going to their children. But what that means for the data is that we get the outcome. If they're successful in overcoming that obstacle, we get information about their successes, but we don't get information about their needs and how we can support them and the obstacles they had to kind of overcome. Just going to fly through desire to be seen, heard, and respected. So with all these groups, it wasn't about I just don't want to engage anymore. It's I want to be engaged with in a way where I feel like my whole person is being seen, where I feel like I'm being respected, that I'm not being subjected to unfair stereotypes. And I think that's something that is pretty easy to understand. So the conceptual framework, it's really based around this idea of consent as the basis. So our aim ultimately is to have people providing data voluntarily. So they know why they're doing it. They want to do it. And yeah, if we get good quality data because people are answering honestly and openly. But that's not always the case. So if people who are informed choose actively not to give data, then we have this idea of voluntary missingness. So voluntary missingness, my assumption was that they were conspiracy theorists that didn't trust the government. Annie's case, when she's self-selected out, is evidence that it's not always that. It could be conspiracy, lack of trust in government, but it could be, you're making a conscious choice. And is the question of do we respect their choice to opt out? Because currently, legally, we're not allowed to opt out. So that's something to consider. Involuntary missingness is really around those individuals who don't have an awareness of either their responsibilities of data that they need to provide or aren't aware of the services that they can access through public resources. And so for those individuals, my concern here is that these are individuals that are generally high needs. They should be accessing public services, but they don't know how. And because they're not accessing, we don't have their data, we aren't seeing them, we don't allocate the resources to them. So there's just almost like a double jeopardy for this group. So for that group, I feel like there is a moral responsibility for us to address this. So methodological missingness is the last one. It's when we've actually successfully collected data about individuals, but through our data cleaning process, through mechanisms like the APC inclusion criteria, we have cleaned them out. And yeah, what we observed from part 2 was that, again, that's not completely at random. There are particular groups that we will clean out because their data is of poor quality or there's not enough of them. And that again has ethnic dimensions. Yes.
That was really amazing. I'm so glad to hear someone else's the same date of birth issues that I have noticed, because I've been looking at that for young people recently, and I've been like, what the hell? It's surprising how many there are. I was curious that you weren't finding many differences for Pacific people, because I've done a little bit of work based on my own, looking at using census and admin data, looking at health conditions, looking at research there is on missingness among Pacific peoples, and that's a big concern in the Pacific research community. And what they're particularly worried about is people that come back and forward to the Pacific, to New Zealand quite frequently, so maybe aren't classed as resident here, or are classed as resident here, but are back and forth. And so it's surprising that you didn't find those.
I mean, the Pacific population, so in addition to the really high level stuff that we did, I also looked at just specific groups, so specific ethnic groups, and did a population pyramid that I learned how to do from Rod Jackson. So looking at that, the Pacific group is a bit of an anomaly. So they have a huge skews in terms of men and women.
Yeah.
Like it's really like all the men are the ones that I think captured in the APC and all the women are not. So there are a lot of differences that is masked by this this high level kind of analysis.
Yeah.
But yeah, and it's always comes down to that question of like, well, what are these two data sets doing? Like, so the census is a census, it's everyone who's here. So ideally, if they've arrived, count them. The APC, although it has census in its name, it's not actually a census. It's more like a usually resident population. So that movement, like that's where we will see that difference. So yeah, they're an interesting group, and I think it's yeah, definitely looking at their data specifically would be really interesting. Yeah. What is my estimate of people missing from the APC who should be included? So between the APC and the census, there's about 100,000 people who are in the census, but not in the APC at the aggregate level. That question is a tricky one, Rod.
So I don't think anyone knows. Yeah.
I don't think anyone knows, and it's also because the APC, one of the benefits of it is that we can do it on the daily. Like we can go APC today, APC tomorrow, and based on like traveling, deaths, birth, that will constantly change. I mean, rest assured, if you're doing aggregate analysis, I think it's fine. But it's just if you're looking at individual level stuff, that's where it gets a little bit tricky.
Yeah, thanks, Annie. I just I should have put guesstimate today. You know, what would be your guesstimate? Given everything you know.
Yeah, I mean, it varies depending on what group you're interested in. So, I mean, if you're looking at Europeans, chances are you're not going to have to worry about it. If you're looking at Māori, you're gonna have to think about it because it seems, and we know it's just like if you're looking at Māori, it just depends on what they've identified with as well, like whether or not they're counted in which group. So, yeah, it's not that simple.
Overall, 100,000. Overall, 100,000.
Overall, 100,000. Yeah.
Yeah, that's 100,000.
Do you think for Māori it might be about a visa, an immigration thing? So because maybe with migrants, we're seeing them arrive and leave, we capture that data in the IDI through all the visa stuff.
Yeah.
If people aren't travelling, they're not leaving New Zealand, they're coming back in again.
Yeah.
Which for many
Europeans
and Māori, but there's lots of people for whom that's the case.
Yeah.
They might be more likely to be missed.
Yeah. I mean, but if you're so I understand, like, so if you're not traveling, so what the inclusion criteria for one of them is whether or not you're traveling in and out. Great, migrants, we like to leave and coming. You know, that's one avenue of being captured. But what's concerning to me is if you aren't leaving, why are we not capturing?
I know exactly. And maybe that's what it is with why we're capturing other ethnicities and not Māori, because they're not leaving New Zealand.
Yeah, but they're not engaging with those really key data sets of work and education and health. Like, why is that not happening? So that again is thinking about what the participants said. It's about what are we doing about the engagement? Data is really secondary. It's really about that contact that we have. That should be the focus.
I also think people do change their ethnicity, like you said, and particularly with the health service. They will not say, they'll say they're European, not any other ethnicity.
Absolutely.
Because they feel, because of the way they'll get treated otherwise.
Yes.
That becomes an issue for us. When we then try and look at that data. So it just comes back to
and I think
the health system.
And it's also like we're thinking about for my Māori participants, that's something that they express is like if they can pass for a year, depending on who they're engaging with, they will just not mention the fact that they're Māori. For our refugee population, they're telling you where they're from, but they're often not getting a good match between the services they're accessing because just because you come from a place, it doesn't mean that you speak the language that shares the name of the place, which often, with good intention, people will link them up with that interpreter, but it's just meaningless.
So Annie, can I just ask, so if I was going to be more specific, among those who, as far as you know, never left, so born here, what proportion of that 100,000 would be those people born here who are not engaging?
So we're looking at like a really, really small proportion. So those that have never left, we have no travel data for them at all. There's only about 20,000-ish.
It is that 20,000, that 21,000 that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's a very small
So it's a
number.
fifth. It's a fifth of your 100,000.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, I guess the other thing to consider is that those two analyses aren't directly comparable, because one is looking at census day, but also at the aggregate, and the other one is APC on the APC reference date, because that was the easier one to do, but it's also looking at unit level. So they're not directly.
Yeah.
Thomas, nice to meet.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. Thank you. I was just wondering, is it really always about engaging with the system that is kind of a problem and driving the missingness? How often is it just the case that, you know, people get not linked to the proper data sets? So it could also be that they are actually living in New Zealand, and you say, yeah, they're apparently not engaging with the system, but actually they go to the doctor all the time, but they're just not linked to the IDI spine. Do you have some idea how often that is the underlying problem?
Thinking about the rate of linkage bias, which Eileen will be able to comment on, you know, again, it's not just about the linkage, it's about that it's that ethnic dimension seems to be so strong throughout. There's something more than just a failure to link or a random probability that something happened.
I would guess, sorry if I can just add, I guess that would also be kind of connected to non-randomness in linkage, that maybe there is some issues with, for example, the way the system records their names or their addresses, and they change more often or not the same in all the different ministries. So this is why they cannot be linked. So I would assume that this kind of, this could explain that there's a problem, different problems for different ethnicities.
Yeah, and I think there's that. I mean, that is something that we already know about the IDI. Like, we're more likely to see linkage bias or linkage errors for women because we're more likely to change our names. So, Eileen, you're nodding. Did you want to add more area?
Yes, and you're absolutely right that yes, non-European are more likely to be missed out, and non-European are also more likely to be false things. So I think not only being inactive in interacting with government agencies is one reason for being missed. Also, the quality of the data being captured is a key reason for why your records can be linked or cannot be linked to the IDI central spine, because everything is done using probabilistic linkage. And that means if your key identifying information is captured correctly, meaning that your date of birth is correct, your full name is correct, your address, your birth country is correct, your chance of being correctly linked or being linked is higher. So I think that might also explain why the European had higher rate of being non-missed. Because the system is designed, even you know, the Sondex. So sometimes it's not a direct comparing of people's name, is comparing the Sondex of people's name, and that algorithm is works better for European names. Yeah.
That does make sense. Yeah. Thanks.
I have a question, Annie. You mentioned that the difference between the APC population and the 2018 census population is more or less the same. With the most current 2023 census, I know that they filled out missing value from the census using admin data, and I think they call this the combined census model rather than saying it's an imputation. And with 2018 census, was it also the case? So the number that you are comparing against, are they purely from census results, or are they from a combined results?
Yeah, so census 2018 did have a combined model out of necessity. So there, I mean, there is a little bit of fudge there. I mean, we could theoretically do it for 2013 and see if it still happens. But yeah, but I think it's just a reflection of, again, that discussion of whether or not we move away from census. I think that that's his hands probably being forced on that, because they can't get away with not doing it anymore. But again, it's just what is that trade-off that we're making? So yeah, I think that's a limitation I'm going to note down. And also one of the tricky things is just keeping with pace. So my analysis looked at APC of its second iteration, and it is now in its third. And so it's just trying to keep pace with those developments that are changing and the subtle changes that they've made. One of the changes, and one of the things to note about APC is the inclusion criteria. If you track it over time, there is slight changes to it. Like at one point when it was still called the ERP, it was 1 year of activity. And the first iteration of the official APC, they considered corrections data. And in the second version, they didn't mention that. And I was a bit suspicious, like, did they just forget to write it down, or did they intentionally remove it? And I went on the Stats IDA Commons, and it seems like they've actually just left it out. And so what does that mean? You know, that means there are groups of people that we know are in prison who are very much in the country. We're not counting them either. So it's just, yeah, it's a bit of a weird territory. Proceed with caution.
As interested in Thomas's comments also about what's missing. As you well know, the health data sets, when we link them deterministically, not probabilistically, and there's many people who are involved in adding to those health data sets who are highly motivated to make sure they're complete because they get paid. Yeah. And I just wondered, have you in your work looked specifically at a comparison of the health contact cohorts, however you define that, and the APC? I mean, we're doing it ourselves at the moment, but I just wonder whether it's possible that some of the health contact cohort data, parts of it may be more complete than APC.
I mean, but the APC, so the health component from the APC covers pretty much all the data sets from all the available data in the health data. So the reason why I didn't do that comparison, because I'm like, we already know the health service utilization cohort is already going to be smaller. We already know that there's going to be biases there. So that's why I didn't do that particular comparison. But somebody could, Rod.
Yeah. No, we are doing, but it's also I mean, we can link those deterministically rather than probabilistically. So, and it's all based on the NHI rather than the name. And I just wonder if there are people, kind of Thomas's question, that there are people, and Eileen's comments as well, whether given you could spell names wrong, you could have the date of birth wrong, but
you can have more than
not have the NHI wrong.
Yeah.
Some people are sharing it now.
Yeah, and I mean, Pacific populations are like that. So it's just
That's right, they share NHIs. Yeah.
They will use another person's NHI. So even it's a different set of limitations. It's There's it's a reflection of how people are just trying to get what they need, the best they can.
Yeah, the easiest way.
Yeah, and it's just, and I guess it will end on the point that I think is most important is that, well, the people that I talk to, they don't care about data. Data is not in their world because they're so focused on getting what they need and surviving.
Yeah.
And so if we can make that easier, that makes our data better. And so just people-centered approach is the final takeaway.